It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 6th talk in the University of New Brunswick's Ideas That Matter speaker series. This series features researchers from the University of New Brunswick's Faculty of Arts, some of Canada's leading scholars, on topics of importance to New Brunswickers. Ideas That Matter has become an integral part of UNB's commitment to create an open forum for the exchange and debate of knowledge. I'm very pleased that in this series we're partnering with the private sector to bring these talks to you. We'd especially like to thank the 13 organizations that have generously come on board as series patrons, and the reason I was pointing is that they're listed on the banner at the back of the room. I'd also like to thank our presenting sponsor tonight, UNB's Associated Alumni, for their generous support and their interest in being part of this dialogue. This series shines a spotlight on the social sciences and humanities, of which I, as a historian, am a part, and it highlights their impact on New Brunswick and on the world. Tonight, the presentation is entitled, as you can see on the screen, Where Have All the Voters Gone? The Death of Politics and Citizen Engagement. We'll hear from Paul Howe and Thom Workman, both professors of political science, who share a deep commitment to political life, but who, as you'll see, approach the question of political participation in rather different ways. Each will give a presentation, then I'll moderate a discussion between the two of them, and then we'll open the floor for questions and comments. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Paul Howe. Prior to joining UNB's Faculty of Arts in 2001, that was a good year, Paul, that's the year that Linda and I came too. Dr. Howe was a research director at the Montreal-based Institute for Research on Public Policy. His current research concentrates on identifying causes of declining political participation in Canada, as well as potential solutions to that problem. His research projects have included studies of political knowledge and its effect on voter turnout, with a particular focus on younger generations, and a collaborative study on social capital in New Brunswick. Professor Howe's recent book, Citizens Adrift, The Democratic Disengagement of Young Canadians, received the 2011 Donald Smiley Prize from the Canadian Political Science Association for the best English language book in Canadian politics and government. Paul, I invite you to make your opening remarks.
Thanks very much, Greg. And it seems to me that citizen engagement can seem as if it's quite alive and well when we have a room full, or even a ballroom full of people coming out on a Wednesday evening to hear two political scientists discuss the state of our democracy. But the concern that brings us here, my main concern at least, is with those who would never think of coming to such a talk. People who are much further removed from the discussions and deliberations that help shape our democratic future. Now, this includes those Canadians who don't participate in the most basic form of democratic participation, which is voting in elections. As I'm sure all of you would be aware, the number of non-voters has been rising significantly over the past 20 years or so. So looking at this figure then, what we see is at the federal level in terms of voter turnout, it used to hover around the 75% mark, but this started to fall in the late 1980s. And ever since the 2000 federal election, turnout has been around the 60% level, including a record low turnout in 2008 of just under 60%. The same trend holds in provincial elections as well. Every province except one has had an election with a record low turnout in the past 10 years. In the Ontario provincial election last year, participation fell below 50% for the first time. And in Alberta, just over 40% voted in their 2008 provincial election. So all of this has been the subject of a lot of public discussion, but not everyone is overly alarmed. As new lows have been reached on a regular basis, the turnout numbers have become a bit less newsworthy. There's also the occasional upward tick in voter participation, such as last May, that seems to counter the idea that there's some kind of an inexorable downward slide that we're on that cannot be reversed. So reflecting these kinds of sentiments, one journalist has coined the phrase turnout nerd, there we are, to refer to the analysts who surfaced after each election to issue dire warnings about the health of Canadian democracy, based on a drop of a couple of percentage points in voter participation. But I would suggest that when we look below what the surface and dig a little bit deeper, we do actually discover some patterns that should be of concern. So we may still be nerds, but we are nerds with a point. So what are the underlying things that we're concerned about? Well, first of all, there's the fact that younger citizens in particular are voting at very low rates. At the federal level, Elections Canada has reported a turnout rate of, for those under age 25, of about 35 to 40% in the past few elections. And these numbers here then are from the 2008 election. And as you see, this then climbs to about a 65 to 75% participation rate among older age groups. So in other words, we have a gap of about 30 to 40 percentage points. And despite the dramatic NDP surge in 2011 and a lot of extra efforts to engage young people, this actually didn't go up at all. It was only about 38% in 2011. In the last New Brunswick provincial election in September 2010, the situation was even worse. Participation among those under 25 was about 30% of all those eligible to participate in that election. Now, the first question someone would likely have when they learn of these numbers is to ask, have young people always voted at such low rates? And the simple answer is no. There's always been some difference between younger and older people, but in the past the gap was considerably smaller. It was about 15 percentage points. And what's more is this difference would completely disappear as young people aged. So the turnout gap was strictly a function of differences associated with various stages of adult life. Now, younger generations are starting off at a significantly lower level. And while this does increase somewhat as they age, they continue to lag behind earlier generations. So this has been happening among new cohorts of voters for some time now. So people now in their 30s vote at lower levels than people in their 30s used to. People now entering their 40s vote at lower levels than people in their 40s used to. So the real concern here is not with people under age 25, which is the group we most often hear about. It's really a broader generational decline in voting. And this generational decline is what's producing this gradual erosion in overall turnout levels. And it's likely to continue in the coming years. Now, in addition to this generational element, there's something else that's quite noteworthy about the pattern of voter abstention among today's younger Canadians. When we look to the past to see why younger people didn't vote quite as much, we find the key reason was because a sizable number of them were sporadic participants in elections. So sometimes they would vote, sometimes not. Nowadays, it's a different group that's most notable. And these are young people who vote in no elections, or a group I call habitual non-voters. And the changes here are really quite striking. We've gone from a situation where virtually no one was a habitual non-voter, which is to say everybody voted at least some of the time. And we've gone to a situation now where habitual non-voters represent about a third of the population under age 30. And that's probably the most dramatic change in voter participation patterns in the past several decades. So to better understand these habitual non-voters and the implications of their growing numbers, we need to learn more about them by looking at some of their other habits and characteristics. First of all, habitual non-voters tend not to be politically engaged in other ways. For example, they're not likely to belong to a political party, which is not all that surprising. But neither are they much involved in activities that involve an element of political protest, such as political protests, demonstrations, consumer boycotts, these kinds of things. And this kind of inaction on other fronts undermines the idea that habitual non-voters are politically aware young people who are making a kind of deliberate statement by not voting. Now, I'm not suggesting there's no one out there who fits this description. No young people who have consciously decided not to participate in elections out of disdain for the choices or a more general disregard for electoral politics. I've certainly had more than one student, and probably a couple here tonight, who have voiced support for the motto, "Don't vote, it only encourages them." But when we look at the population more generally through survey-based research, and we ask these habitual non-voters why they didn't vote in a given election, their answers are quite revealing. Most will say they did not know what the issues were or know which person to vote for. They just weren't interested in politics, or they're just not really sure why, which is sort of the shoulder-shrugging response. And these are answers that suggest incapacity and indifference rather than a kind of pointed withdrawal. When we use surveys to look directly at levels of knowledge about politics in the Canadian population, we can certainly see why many would cite a lack of knowledge as a reason for not voting. Levels of political knowledge are abysmally low among younger citizens, again, on the whole, on average, and seem to have diminished over time. So this next graph shows some differences between age groups on some basic political knowledge questions asked on a national survey from the year 2008. And the numbers, I think, largely speak for themselves. So we find then that younger adults were considerably less likely to know the name of the leader of the Liberal Party at that time, Stéphane Dion, to be able to name a position appointed by the Prime Minister, or even to be able to name the Premier of their own province. And you see the numbers there, the people who had the correct answers to these questions. Now, on that last question, we have some interesting over-time comparisons, because if we go back to 1984, we found that 87% of people under the age of 35 knew the name of their premier. As you see here, it had fallen to 61% by 2008. And on that same question, a survey done by Elections Canada just after the 2011 election, again with people under age 35, found the number had now dropped to 53%. So we're just at a level now where only half of young people actually know the name of the premier. Now, these kinds of questions can seem like political trivia, and therefore not really that important to effective democratic citizenship. But I'd suggest it's pretty hard to arrive at a deeper understanding of politics without acquiring some of these basic concrete facts. So to my mind, they are markers of important changes that are taking place in the political knowledge base of Canadians. And it's a base that seems to be especially eroding at the lower foundations, where there are some who really are knowing very little about their politics. Now, in addition to these low knowledge levels, habitual non-voters, whom I've mentioned, there also tend to be from relatively disadvantaged backgrounds. If about a third of those under age 30 are habitual non-voters, that number is closer to 50% among those who haven't finished high school, and about 20% among those with a university education. There's a similarly large gap when we look at income levels. So what we're seeing is that the gaps in participation across socioeconomic groups are growing larger among younger generations as their overall participation levels diminish. Now, out of all these patterns then, I think there's some effective responses to the claim that we're just being turnout nerds when we raise the flag about a couple of percentage point decline in turnout, because really what we're seeing is there's a strong generational basis to this. Turnout levels are apt to continue falling in the future. We already have majority governments elected with less than 25% of the active electorate, or the eligible electorate. That's going to fall further, below 20% and even lower. And this shrinking in the pool of active voters is associated with important inequalities, generational but also growing socioeconomic ones, which is going to affect the policies that are put in place. And all of this is quite an intractable problem. It's not a matter of people coming and going as circumstance dictates, that is to say in terms of voting. These are people who are dropping out more completely. Now, this withdrawal of a sizable block of young Canadians from the arena of electoral politics is not only relevant to the workings of elections, it also matters to the politics that unfolds between elections. And this is not quite as obvious a point, because many people who vote regularly in elections are quiet, indeed quiescent citizens between elections. The people who sometimes agitate, people who protest, petition, call their MPs and MLAs, attend public meetings and so on, that's a smaller subset of the population. And these activists are the people who seem to be trying to hold government to account on a more ongoing basis, not the so-called average voter. So, following this sort of reasoning, some would draw quite a sharp line between traditional electoral politics, which seems to imply quite a deferential role for the citizen, and bolder forms of citizen activism. But I'd suggest that voters at the base of the system are actually more important than this account would suggest. The key point is that the actions of activist citizens are often ineffective in and of themselves. Often they spring up rapidly in response to some controversy, but they fade away just as fast, with no real impact. Their actions, I would suggest, only become effective when it's clear they're starting to sway the general public, when it seems as if they're shaping opinion in a way that may endure right through to the next election. Activists need an attentive audience of thoughtful voters if their efforts are to gain traction. And when this does occur, it gives their movement oxygen to the point where it can potentially influence government action. And I think we saw these dynamics in action with the movement against the sale of NB Power, kind of an escalating mobilization between activists and so-called average voters. Now, at the federal level, on the other hand, over the past few years, this hasn't really happened. Citizen protest against a number of controversial policies has failed to acquire any similar momentum. When too many citizens are habitual non-voters, largely tuned out of what's happening politically, the government is given a relatively free hand to pursue its own agenda, despite the vocal outcries from groups of citizen activists. So this overhead then captures the basic dynamic or connection I'm suggesting. On the one hand, you have citizens adrift. This is the cover of my book. And the suggestion is this editorial cartoon from the Globe and Mail caught my eye, the word adrift at the top there, suggesting that government itself then is adrift, no longer adhering to certain core values and principles if we don't have a vigilant citizenry that is paying close attention. Now, I've described a problem of disengaged younger generations, outlining some of the consequences of the problem, the underlying trends giving rise to it. But if we want to go further into the matter, we would ask ourselves, what really is the root source of this apparent sea change in democratic attitudes and behaviors among rising generations? Now, the key transformation to my mind, to talk quite broadly, is growing individualism within society. And this is a doctrine and a way of life that's been steadily advancing over the course of several centuries in Western societies, but really at an accelerating pace since the end of World War II, and especially since the 1960s. This individualism encompasses a wide range of values and behavioral norms. It includes a premium on personal autonomy and in opposition to the dictates of tradition and social expectation. Also a focus on self-interest sometimes at the expense of the interests and concerns of others. Now, some of the connections between this rising individualism and citizen disengagement are quite direct. For example, a lot of people have observed younger generations are less likely to view voting as a civic duty. And that's clearly reflective of, I think, of a broader rejection of authoritative social norms. But a more general consequence I'd like to talk about of rising individualism is its effect on our sense of community. Now, I wouldn't suggest that this sense of community has been or ever will be extinguished entirely. I think the desire for community, for connection to others, it's a very basic human impulse. It will always manifest itself in some way or another. But I do think that individualism affects the forms that community tends to take in the current age. It favors those ties and connections that are felt to be self-chosen and to have personal meaning and resonance. And what that has meant is the weakening of those community ties that don't fit this description, ties that are sometimes felt to be more binding and obligatory, that are handed down to us through the channels of tradition or birthright. Now, the connection that we feel, or don't feel as the case may be, to our province and to our country are some of the things I have in mind here. So if we look at the figures in this next graph, taken from another large national survey from a few years back, what we see are some very striking differences across age categories in the sense of attachment felt towards Canada and towards people's place of residence. And obviously you see that the percentage feeling a very strong attachment is much higher among older generations. Now, the significance here is that these kinds of attachments are, not surprisingly, particularly relevant to citizen engagement on a provincial and national scale. When we don't feel a strong attachment to Canada as a national community, we're not likely to feel particularly connected to the national government or the national political system more generally. It's no longer our government, but simply the government. There's a strong sense of detachment from these institutions, and that has a lot of important implications. It means, first of all, we don't demand better of government or political actors when they drift off course. I was speaking not so long ago with a local journalist about the voter suppression charges that we're hearing a lot about recently. And from his conversations with quite a few people, he suggested he saw a real difference between older Canadians who were quite outraged by this and younger people who were just more cynical about it. It wasn't that they approved of it, but they did view it with a certain sense of, I guess, cynical detachment. It is a problem, the feeling is, but it's not really my problem to get too worked up about. This was his observation. A similar sort of detachment, I think, appears around issues that are far removed from our own experiences and priorities. There was a recent commentary in the newspaper about Aboriginal peoples. It argued that we won't make real advances on this front in addressing some of the dire challenges that those communities face until all Canadians see this as our shared responsibility to address. To quote from that piece, "The problem is not owned primarily by either the Government of Canada or the First Nations. Canadians as a whole have to take ownership of the challenges facing First Nations communities. But an important prerequisite for that to happen, I would suggest, is that we have to feel that more general sense of national attachment and commitment." So this quotation then from the American philosopher Richard Rorty captures the perspective that I'm articulating here. Rorty wrote, "National pride is to countries what self-respect is to individuals, a necessary condition for self-improvement." Now, to some of your ears, that national pride might sound like a bit of an old-fashioned kind of notion. But what Rorty really means here is really that same idea that I'm talking about, a commitment, a concern for public life on a national scale. But that term pride actually is quite useful, and it's useful because it evokes the emotional content of national connectedness. It also suggests some of the counterpart emotions that can arise when wrongful actions are taken by those in positions of power, such as anger at how a national election was corrupted by dirty and/or illegal tricks, or shame at how our country has treated First Nations peoples. And these kinds of emotions are very powerful motives, forces for action, for change, for engagement. Now, in suggesting that there's been an erosion in our sense of national connectedness, and that's part of the story behind citizen disengagement, I don't want to suggest that this disengagement is strictly a societal problem, that political actors should shoulder none of the responsibility. Political actors potentially have a very important, perhaps even decisive, role to play in building and reinforcing our sense of national attachment and commitment. Through their actions, they can help instill a sense of mutual respect and shared purpose in citizens. There are also systematic reforms, democratic reforms we could undertake to make government more inclusive of all Canadians, all citizens. And conversely, political actors, I think, can greatly contribute to our division, to our fragmentation when they are small-minded, petty, and focused on partisan advantage, as all too often they are. So all told then, in conclusion, we do have a very challenging undertaking before us involving both citizens and political players working together to create a better democracy that we all care about and all wish to participate in. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Now I'd like to introduce Thom Workman as Paul brings up the next slide set for Thom. Dr. Workman is chair of the Department of Political Science. He teaches courses on politics and music, but I don't think he's going to sing tonight, political literature, and late modern political philosophy. His general research focuses on critiques of modernity, with a special focus on both political economy and social philosophy. His latest book, If You're in My Way, I'm Walking, The Assault on the Working Class Since 1970, was shortlisted for the Rick Davidson Book Prize in Canadian Political Economy in 2010. If I can make a parenthetical comment, Rick Davidson was a well-known editor at the University of Toronto Press, both of history and social science, and actually was the first editor I worked with on my first book. He was a terrific guy. He is a terrific guy. I think he's still alive, actually, living in Scotland. Dr. Workman is currently completing a book-length study on the ideological reception of the ancient historian Thucydides. I shouldn't be screwing up that name. In his 2011 article, The Left After Politics, He contends that we should quit politics in order to confront the general political malaise that has beset our world. Thom?
Thank you. Welcome. It's nice to see you. The idea for this talk was born out of a rather innocent conversation that Paul and I actually had one day when he saw in our display case the article I had written and published in Studies in Political Economy, and in the first page of the article it actually said that young people should quit politics. Paul was writing and pushing the idea that we had to get younger people more involved in politics, and we realized that we were kind of saying something rather different, at least on the surface, but that in some ways we shared a deeper commitment. So it's nice to be able to explore that in this kind of a format. And I hope I don't accidentally knock down the slide here. I want to first point out something that I think might sound a little odd, initially at least, and that's that the statistics that we see on voter turnout or the statistics that we see on voter apathy are actually remarkably high. I'm amazed, and I never cease to be amazed, that even 2/3 or half or 40% of the Canadian electorate bothers to vote at all. And the reason I say this is that when we reflect on the several distrusts that lie at the heart of the voting public, or when we think about the general recession of confidence that people have in elected officials and politicians, then I think we can anticipate even lower levels of voter turnout, or higher levels of voter apathy. So the fact that we see 50% in the American context commonly, 2/3 in the Canadian context, I think is remarkable. And there must be some deeper commitment to the political process among Canadians. Perhaps it's just the fear that if you leave people in power for too long, that they tend to succumb to what was once called the iron law of oligarchy. So every once in a while, you got to get out and you got to turf them out. And the reason I suggest this is that I think there are very powerful forces at work that are promoting both apathy towards civic-centered politics and even an hostility towards politicians and the civic-centered process. And it's that, and this apathy, I think, is a symptom of a much deeper malaise. And I want to talk about two aspects of that particular malaise this evening to try to bring it into, to bring the statistics that we have been shown into a slightly different focus. The two aspects that I want to talk about are first what I can call, or what I call neoliberal indifference, or an indifference that has been created in the last 3 or 4 decades. And it'll be clear as I go along. This is something that is more conjunctural, more immediate to us, more contemporary. And the second thing that I'm going to talk about, the second aspect of this malaise, is what I call the dumbing down of politics. And it'll sound a little more unusual at first, but I think as I talk about it, it will make more sense. So let me first talk about neoliberal indifference. And in order to bring this into initial kind of conceptualization, I want to put a picture up here of Antonio Gramsci. He's a fairly well-known social critic. It would be hard to overdraw Gramsci's influence on social criticism and cultural criticism in the 20th century. And Gramsci is famous for a number of things, but perhaps most famous for his claim that everyone is a philosopher. And when Gramsci made that claim, all he really meant was that everybody harbors a sophisticated political view and a sophisticated set of political understandings. And this includes convictions that we have about the world around us, and those convictions usually reflect our unique kind of horizons, our unique kind of cultural perspectives. He emphasized that the convictions that we have are often collective, but they're also born of our individual experiences, especially our experiences in working life. And if I want to wrap my head around Gramsci's idea that everyone is a philosopher, I just have to think of my grandmother. My grandmother would sit in her living room and she'd listen to a conversation going on. She'd be reading her Reader's Digest. And every once in a while, she'd peer over her Reader's Digest and she'd say, well, you know, I think I think what we have to bear in mind is that this is a rich man's world. And then she'd go back to her Reader's Digest, and that was the end of it. And Gramsci would be the first person to tell us that that is actually a very sophisticated political assessment of the world. And he'd also be the first person to tell us that it often doesn't improve, that the insights of some of our foremost social critics don't improve on that basic kind of an insight. If we bear this kind of idea in mind that Gramsci had when he said everybody's a philosopher, it's important to understand that increasingly in the neoliberal era, people have become convinced that irrespective of what party is in power, irrespective of which governments come and go, very little ever changes at the level of public policy. Very little actually changes. It doesn't matter if, in the Canadian context, if it's Liberal, Conservative, or NDP, public policy basically stays the course. In the American context, if it's the Democrats or the Republicans, once again, nothing really ever changes. This is what's the policy paradigm that is more or less in play here and has been for the last three and a half decades is sometimes called neoliberal austerity or the neoliberal policy paradigm. We are very familiar with this because it's exactly what was introduced yesterday, and it was exactly what is going to be introduced probably for years to come. Spending cuts, government downsizing, tax cuts, especially to corporations, but we don't tend to talk about that, privatization, social program restructuring, deregulation, and rollbacks in labor laws. This is the basket of policies that people have come to associate with the age of falling expectations. And all the age of falling expectations really means is that younger people now, especially, have truly come to believe that their lives may not be as good as the lives of their parents or grandparents. And also in this context, left and right no longer seems to matter. The old political spectrum seems increasingly meaningless. In Canada, as we saw in Ontario in the early 1990s, the NDP government under Bob Rae rammed home, really, the neoliberal agenda with as much verve and alacrity as Frank McKenna was doing in this province at the same time. In the American context, for example, we have seen the Obama administration ramp up wars, cut back social spending, and roll back labor laws with as much enthusiasm as the Bush administration ever did. So there's a real sense now that left and right doesn't matter. Public disappointment, or the public reaction to the idea that little or nothing ever changes, sometimes runs deep. And there are real, widespread convictions that are emerging that power, meaningful political power, really does not lie at the voter box. And we saw that, we've seen this in the past, but we saw this most recently with the Occupy movement. There was a real sense that the austerity kinds of budgets that we come to associate with neoliberalism, and this is kind of one of the signature placards of the Occupy movement, and I wanted to put it up here because of the Black Harbor connection to Brunswick sardines here in New Brunswick, but there's a sense in which we are feeding the 99%, I suppose. And this sensibility, this sensitivity, these understandings that are born of the fact that everyone is a philosopher in the Gramscian sense does seem to be guiding public disappointment and voter apathy. In this context, we have really lost sight of the basic insight of the American jurist, famous jurist, Oliver Wendell Holmes, when he quipped that taxes and public spending go hand in hand with a civilized society, and he did that long ago. And so many people have concluded, since nothing changes, why bother voting? Why bother voting at all? And as a political scientist, I have to at least acknowledge or admit that that is a perfectly rational response. But there is an even deeper part to the malaise that has created rather profound apathy, at least towards the formal civic-centered political process. And that has to do with public talk or political discourse, as we sometimes call it in political science, or as pundits sometimes say. You'll hear them say political discourse or political rhetoric. And the underlying point that I want to make, or the main point I really want to push here, is that political rhetoric has been continually dumbed down. Political talk is now dominated by these kinds of things: sound bites, buzzwords, shibboleths, catchphrases, one-liners, dismissive epithets, engorged rhetoric, imperialist euphemisms, and mythic accounts of history. And it would take me my full 20 minutes if I kept giving examples of those things. Public discourse seems to be increasingly about shutting out rather aggressively, or establishing rather aggressively, the boundaries of permissible speech. This can be said, this cannot be said. It is replete with the kind of words that George Orwell called thought stoppers. He coined this term to refer to words that meant if you merely say them, all you have to do is say them, and all thinking shuts down. All thinking comes to an abrupt termination. For example, during the heyday of the 1980s, I don't want to date anybody in this room, so I'll call it the heyday of the 1980s. You may recall Ronald Reagan's reference to the L word, which was liberalism. And that, of course, was an epithet in the American context for at least 20 years. If we fast forward, one cannot help but think that we have a number of Orwellian thought stoppers in contemporary political parlance. And I think of words such as government debt or terrorism. The mere utterance of these words usually determines the course of the unfolding diatribe, and rational discussion often gets foreclosed in a hurry. It was the great philosopher Ernst Cassirer who really established a paradox that is central to understanding the degradation of politics in the political age. I didn't really need to put his picture up, but he looks so professorial that I always want to do it. Cassirer basically established a simple paradox. He said, on the one side, we have crises. And he's speaking of the modern age, especially of the 20th century. On the one side, we have crises. We have wars. We have runaway inflation. We have disintegrating economies. And on the other side, he said, thanks to this new breed of politician that he called the political myth maker, the spin doctor, and the speechwriter, he said, we have lost our ability to speak about our crises in a rational way. What they give us, he said, are magic words, words that have compressed meanings, and words that are so full of vitriol that the mere utterance of the word absolutely suspends rational discussion. So his point is, at the very moment when we need a rational public discussion about problems, our political world has let us down, and politics lets us down miserably. We cannot help but think we have reached this point, the point of Cassirer's paradox in the contemporary world. We have the 2008 economic decline. We have more than 25 civil wars going on at the moment. We have ecological trends that are deeply disturbing, to say nothing of crushing global poverty. And precisely at this point, politics steps up and delivers its litany of meaningless phrases, epithets, sound bites, buzzwords, stock phrases, and one-liners. More disturbing political trends include finger-pointing, especially at people of color, fear-mongering at those peoples who would dare to be different from us, scapegoating of the worst form, the coarsest caricatures of the great Abrahamic religions, and, as it never fails, lots of jingoism. And along the way, we are all too often retreated to healthy doses of smearing, slanderous name-calling, and we often see reputations besmirched with impunity. The citizen voter is meant to be swayed or charmed, maybe rendered angry or indignant, but never encouraged to reflect rationally on the matters of the day. Politics has become pure spectacle. Politics is entertainment by other means. And the language of politics has become completely unhinged. It's lost any reference, or it's frequently lost any reference, to something real, or something that is out there and can be confirmed or verified. One of the most interesting books that has come along in the last 10 years is this book by a professor emeritus at Princeton University, Harry Frankfurt. It's simply called On Bullshit. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to establish bullshit as a legitimate linguistic category where language and words had absolutely no reference to anything that was purportedly real. And you'll notice in the quote there, I won't read it, that political rhetoric is the kind of perfect paradigm for bullshit. In this world, almost anything goes. In its most aggressive forms, we have to remember that when we enter into a world where almost anything goes, in its the most aggressive forms of political rhetoric that were once on the margins, especially in the late 1970s and 1980s, are now part of the mainstream political discourse in the early part of the 21st century. Now, and if you watch the recent GOP debates, it might be providing a kind of disconcerting indication of where things might be headed. As a political scientist, I watch them, but I have to honestly say I watch them just to be amused. It beats most sitcoms. Now, we might not be as bad at this in Canada, or at least as aggressive in Canada as is the case in the United States. And I don't know why, but it's interesting that many American politicians who have participated in this extreme and aggressive rhetoric often have to cancel speaking engagements in Canada because they fear that the protests and demonstrations are going to be so severe. And that happened very recently with Dick Cheney. He canceled an engagement in Toronto. So we are we are less aggressive than the Americans. The Americans, they give you Tina Fey doing Sarah Palin. We get Luba Goy doing Kim Campbell. It's not quite as, it doesn't have the same kind of flair, certainly. But the underlying comedic grist is exactly the same. The degradation of political discourse is exactly the same. When we most need to reflect on our world in a rational and thoughtful way, we get empty phrases like Washington is broken or Ottawa is spend crazy. And therefore, many people simply turn away. Why might we speak of the death of politics? Because we have become inured really both to its irrelevance and to the manner of its delivery. Quitting this sort of politics is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Indeed, quitting this sort of politics can be easily construed as a political act. Politics is no longer speaking to the concerns that animate us in an age of falling expectations. It was the ancients who first reminded us that authentic politics should be connected with rational discourse, and who cautioned us against their demagogues who had really severed the important social link between politics and rational discussion. And their demagogues stood out. Their demagogues stood out as egregious violators of many political principles, as people who tried to just stir up the mob and whip the mob into a frenzy, usually for crass and vulgar political gain. All we seem to have is demagoguery. All we seem to have are magic words and sound bites, and I suspect that we are the worse for it. And quitting this sort of politics, quitting this decaying sort of politics is perfectly reasonable, but that does not mean that we are quitting ever being political. We can't do that. You can't quit being political. Years ago, the social critic Seymour Martin Lipset in 1960 said, just by way of conclusion, in a book called Political Man, he said that politics is now boring. It was a somewhat famous quote attributed to him. I think he's wrong. Most political scientists think he's absolutely wrong. But politics has certainly become pure spectacle, and it could never be resuscitated too soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Paul, do you want to join us up here? So I'm going to try and warm you all up, although probably Tom already has, by posing a couple of questions to our speakers, and then I'll turn it over to you for a Q&A session. From what both of you said, I think you're both clearly expressing considerable concern about the state of not just Canadian politics, but of democratic politics throughout the countries that are most like us and that we're most familiar with. So given that similarity, although you took it in very different places, what would, and given that you're both political scientists and spend every day, or most days, thinking about not only your research but your teaching, what would effective political education look like to address the problems that you have identified? Maybe we'll start with Paul, given that Thom had the most recent word.
Sure. Well, I know Thom has presented ideas in the piece of his that I read around the notion of citizens needing to sort of withdraw from formal politics and find venues where they can engage in more genuine, rational discussion and involvement with one another as a form of political education. And I would entirely agree with that as kind of an end goal, that this is what we want, is a vibrant, dynamic citizen of engaged, society of engaged citizens. At the same time, I think to get there, we probably need some more, some other kinds of tools. The one I would turn to is civics education, which is, of course, something we always would talk about in terms of creating political education, political knowledge among people. I think it's important because it goes across the board. I talked about some of the socioeconomic differences in participation that we see. We need to reach all people, all young people, equip everybody with certain basic tools, knowledge, and skills in order to be able to participate in that kind of vibrant democratic society. When you get into the realm of talking about advocating civics education, there's quite a variety of ways in which that's done. There's kind of very traditional civics, which tends not to be in favor so much these days, of sort of just giving people a basic understanding of how government works and so on. Nowadays, there's more emphasis placed on more dynamic ways of teaching the subject, partly as a way of actually engaging young people, giving them interest in the subject, but also a sense that one wants to avoid just sort of indoctrinating young people. One wants them to be critical thinkers who question things. They don't just accept the way the system is. And essentially, I guess I see merits in both of these. Now, when we talk about the second of these two approaches, a practical concern that arises in the school system is that we don't want to have civics education turn into political education or politically biased education. So in other words, we're trying to have dynamic discussion, interactive things, really getting students engaged, but then teachers may just impart their own views on students, and there's concerns about that. So I think there's ways around that, though. You can, for example, let students take ownership and control of this themselves. What are the issues they want to grapple with? What do they want to talk about? There's also an interesting initiative right now in New Brunswick on an experimental sort of basis where all of the political parties are going into the schools together to do sort of presentations to people to say, okay, now we have political neutrality because we have every view presented. So certainly I do agree that, you want those sorts of more innovative and dynamic approaches. At the same time, there's something to be said for the more traditional elements. And I think I'd make this point, that I kind of agree that, everybody in a sense is a philosopher, everybody has some intuitive political understandings, but I suspect that quite a lot of people are a bit inhibited if they're lacking that more formal understanding of just how does politics work. What is it? How does the parliamentary system work? What do the political parties stand for? What's a bit of their history? Just that more traditional stuff. I think it can be a bit inhibiting if you have sort of intuitions and feelings, but you don't know quite how that interacts or articulates with the formal political system. And then I do think it can be kind of an inhibiting thing. So I think that more formal knowledge is quite useful and relevant. So those are some of the things I'd like to see in terms of a more wholehearted approach to actually educating our young people about our politics.
Thanks, Paul. Thom?
Thank you. It is the case, certainly, that political knowledge, in the sense of fact-based knowledge, is very low. It's also worth bearing in mind that sometimes people who have a rather profound understanding of politics exhibit remarkably low levels of knowledge. The only Canadian Prime Minister to win 3 majority elections got the date of Confederation wrong, and he was off and wasn't really terribly troubled by it, and certainly in no way did it compromise his understanding of politics in any way whatsoever. Education has to do something very simple. It has to return to the church basement, and it has to return to the church basement for a long, long time, for afternoons and evenings. We often, when we're developing commentary on society, we often exaggerate the greatness of the past and the kind of decline of the present age. We have a natural instinct almost to go to a golden age. But in the case of politics, it's been fairly clearly proven that political discussion in the 19th century lasted a long time. It would last for the afternoon, and then people would break for dinner, and then they'd reconvene in the evening, and they'd go on for another 2 or 3 or 4 hours. And this was a regular part, a regular staple of many different groups and organizations and communities in not only Canada, but in the North American context and frequently in the European context. Now, political education unfolds either in the school system or through the mass media. The former has, arguably enough to do. The mass media has to be bypassed altogether. Political education through the mass media is not the way to go. The only way to do it, and you're going to have to forgive me, I'm an academic and I'm about to use the word organic, and I apologize because we love that word. Education has to be organic. It has to be in the church basement, and the one thing it cannot do is it cannot undermine or undercut the wisdom that people have about politics, their senses of the real sources of power in a society, their senses of their own vulnerability, and their senses of what really needs to be done. Education in no circumstances should undercut that wisdom, that organic wisdom, but what is needed is the opportunity to take that organic wisdom and to turn it into sustained discussions. We have to find those venues. Those venues have to be outside of the mass media. And I think the best place for them is the church basement, and they have to last a long time. We have to, in order to do politics properly, we need to have sandwiches with us and make a day of it.
Thanks, Tom. That's probably the first time you've endorsed churches in a while. And given what's happening on the American right, I'm not sure that that's the place where we want that discussion to go on. But that aside, I think the notion that you were building on goes to the point of the second question that I'd have, is that both of you are, in your own ways, presented in your own ways, critiques of individualism. And clearly the counter notion that I think was underlying in, again, very different ways, both of your presentations, was that the breakdown of a sense of community, the lack of community, is something that is part of the root of some of these difficulties. So how do we build community and out of that political engagement? Who'd I start with the last time? Tom, yours.
Well, that's the hardest question. That's not only the hardest question for a political scientist, that's the hardest sociological question, period. The challenge, the kind of trends and tendencies and forces that are at work that are disintegrating society today are very powerful. And they've been well documented and people have talked about them. And for us to try to circumvent those forces and to find safe venues is extremely difficult. One of the greatest difficulties with respect to the relationship between community and politics is that the community is not about to spontaneously form. It's always there as a kind of latent force or a latent fact, but it's not really there in practice. In a day-to-day sense, our communities are a bit truncated and so on. Actually coming up with the necessary degree of social interaction that is going to generate sustained discussion, especially of a political nature, is one of the biggest challenges that we have. But I think there are venues that are there. I think they're there. We do have the opportunity for meetings. We have community centers. I've already mentioned church basements. We have fora in the context of universities, public schools, and so on, again, that can bring people together for sustained discussion and dialogue. But it is one of the greatest difficulties that we face, and I don't think there's an easy solution.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with it. It's an incredibly challenging element of this discussion. Communities can come in a lot of different forms, from the smallest scale to the largest. I do think a lot of politically active people are sometimes searching out and thinking about this question and on what level should I try to be involved and what is my community. We hear the expression sometimes think globally, act locally, so this sense that, we have to operate on different levels. But I guess I've made this case then that we do have to try to swing our orientation a bit around to the national level and provincial as well, in terms of interacting with the governments that actually have the greatest power to effect change. these days still in our lives. And I guess I might come back to that, and I guess this idea of inculcating a stronger national identity can have kind of a conservative tinge to it, or a sound to it. It can sound about, are we talking about here about ideas of some kind of traditional values, traditions that we're trying to preserve, and certainly that is one way of taking the notion of kind of strengthening a national identity. On the other hand, I guess with the Rorty quote, I'm kind of articulating a slightly different way of coming at that, a sense that this national identity, well, for one, we're really talking about it more as a means to an end rather than an end in itself. It's a way of getting people to focus on a particular level for the purposes of creating a better society, really, rather than for the sake of national identity per se. It's also about something that's much more forward-looking, something about achieving a national identity as opposed to preserving an existing national identity. And therefore, it is achieved in good part through politics is the way that we try to do this. And it's about having, I think, a more ambitious politics, a more visionary politics on the part which has to come partly from political leaders, but working in conjunction with citizens to create these sorts of things. Someone who's articulated this idea recently is Ken Dryden's written a book called Becoming Canada, which actually is articulating quite similar notions. Another author who's given a specific area where we should be trying to do something, latching on to an ambition for our nation, is Michael Byers, wrote a book called Intent for a Nation, little play on Lament for a Nation, but it's Intent for a Nation. And he talked about the idea that in terms of our international involvements, we need to return to some of our traditions, our principles that we moved away from, basically of liberal internationalism and trying to create a better world. Again, he talks about, a more ambitious Canada. I think that how do we actually achieve that, though? How do we actually move towards that? We somehow have to create venues, I think, where political leaders can be a little bit more far-reaching and visionary. One concrete notion is that our political leaders rarely have a chance to expound at length on their ideas and visions for the longer term. The only time we hear from them at length is at election time in these televised debates. And there it's very much back and forth sniping about very focused and narrow issues about what they do in the coming 2 or 3 years. I'd say maybe we need to have an annual sort of debate, if you like, or get together of our political leaders where they all say, here's how I see our country 15 years from now. Here's the Canada I'd like to see. Here's my vision, the other leaders, my vision. It's not really a debate. It's about presenting your views of what Canada could be and should be. And so, doing this on an annual basis, hopefully Canadians would tune in church basements or elsewhere, in their homes, maybe through the mass media, of course. But trying to think creatively about ways we can kind of move beyond the petty quarrels that we do sometimes see in our politics, and allow for that sort of interaction between citizens and political leaders to kind of have a greater sense of creating a sense of national community through a more ambitious politics.
Thanks, Paul. Another way, of course, is this is not a church basement, but this series is obviously an attempt to do just what's being described. So, audience, over to you for questions to either or both. Maybe I'll ask people to identify themselves, just for everybody. And I see you, Jackie. And you can use the microphone if you need it to make yourself heard, or just yell it out. Jackie.
Okay, I don't think I need the microphone.
And you're Jackie who? Thank you.
A question first for Thom and then a comment for Paul. Intrigued to hear you talk about how we have a tendency to romanticize the past, but at the same time you're arguing that we did have a golden age where at one time we discussed rational politics and now we've evolved into demagoguery and sniping and entertainment. I would put to you that people were in church basements in the 19th century because there was no television, there was no radio. It was a form of entertainment as much as civic involvement. So I'm not sure really how much is different in that sense. I mean, there have been differences and changes in technology and stuff that make the way that people engage. So if you could speak to
Sure.
what makes this particularly different, and just a ray of hope in terms of youth involvement in politics. The Liberal Party at their convention this year had overwhelming numbers of attendance and the largest number of youth involved in their thing. So in addition to church basements, I think civil political discourse can happen within parties.
Right.
Yeah. Was there another question here on the same topic, or?
Well,
Oh, okay.
we'll cluster them if we get a bunch flowing. Just endorsing anti-clericalism.
Oh, okay. Anti-clericalism, yes, okay. Okay, I wasn't sure. No, I don't agree. But let me indicate why, Jackie. Yes, that would be good. The problem is, speak up? Yeah. Oh, okay. The problem is the very nature of the discussion changes as the media forms change. And that's been well documented and well established. And I'm just drawing on arguments. I'm not coming up with these arguments on my own, obviously, but some rather well-known people have made them, like Neil Postman. And as you change the fora, the nature of what is being talked about changes. And as we moved, the church basement in no way resembles the mass media today, in no way resembles the kind of dialogue that we might hear occasionally on the radio. And the reason for that is because one is necessarily reducing itself to the soundbite. One is necessarily reducing itself to a largely formatted discussion that is dictated by the very nature of the technology. The other one had discussions that were open-ended and went on for hours and hours and hours. I am told, I have read, that these things often went on for 12 or more hours in the course of a typical day. And we get nothing even remotely approximating that. So that the mass media today is basically creating a form of political discussion or political rhetoric that is full of these pernicious terms that are anti-intellectual, ideas that do not flower or blossom into any kind of an open, rational discussion about things political, precisely at the moment when we most need it. If there is to be a regeneration of politics in a way that is open and reflective and rational, especially in the youth, it absolutely will have to happen outside of the mass media.
Okay, just to be clear, I didn't mean that the discussion on the mass media was the same as the discussion in the church basement. I'm saying political discussion in the church basement was a form of entertainment for people when they did not have movies and
Oh, no. It could be at times, yes, but it was discussion about very serious matters. They were sustained. They were topic-centered. If we're talking about just people filling time, I suppose that at that time, rather than watching Geraldo, they went into the church basement and did have very serious political discussions. But these were sustained, rational discussions. And the length of them alone is confusing to us when we are used to something that really shouldn't last more than 10 minutes, an hour at the longest. So there really is a difference. There was a difference, and it's a significant difference. And I'm certainly not. These are not my conclusions when I suggest that if there is to be a resuscitation of politics, and especially if there is to be a resuscitation of politics among today's youth, it is going to have to be outside of the mass media or apart from the mass media. Finding those venues is not easy. Finding those venues is extremely difficult, but it's going to have to be outside those venues.
Paul, do you want to comment on the Liberal Party?
Well, I just know that when we talk about young people's participation and look at political parties, you know, at least in a few years back, sort of the average age of a party member was about 60 years old and getting older all the time. Now, it may be that in the renewal process for the Liberals and then for the NDP and so forth, maybe there is some drawing in of young people, and certainly that was a big part of the 2011 election around the NDP surge and young people getting quite animated in that. So there may be some positive prospects there. I'm not sure how far it's spreading, but yeah, I guess we'll see. Yeah.
The back row? No, the gentleman that was standing, yes.
There's clearly a number of solutions, which we're announcing a few ideas right now. But I heard an interesting presentation on the radio a couple of months ago by the president of the Jeune Francophone Students Association. It's a young lady who was lobbying, presenting the idea of lowering the voting age to 16.
Could you identify yourself, please?
My name is David Brown. I'm just back.
Excellent.
Go ahead.
I actually don't know how widespread that is. It's certainly an idea that's come forward in a number of places. I think it might have been used in Germany in some local elections, and it had some positive effects. I don't think it's very widespread. Although, on a bit of a side note, I know in Scotland, where they're going to hold a referendum on independence, they know that support for independence is lower among younger people, so they're now planning to lower the voting age to 16 for their referendum on independence. In any event, I think it has some merit to it. I mean, part of the idea is at the age of 16, there's a lot of possibilities for providing sort of supports for young people. A lot of it, again, maybe through the school system, where there'd be all sorts of possibilities of talking about the election and helping young people to have the necessary tools to do that. Out in BC, they're going to try something a little bit different, which is simply registering young people at age 16 to vote, which just, I mean, all you're thinking there is that now you can't be registered till you're 18. An election comes and a lot of people are not registered, and they actually don't get it sorted out in time. So if you do that earlier, you can take care of that. That's a smaller thing. But in general, I think it's something possibly worth considering, but we probably might want to see it unrolled in a few other places and see what the outcome is.
I think I might be more inclined to raise the driving age to 18.
What about the drinking age?
The drinking age? Oh, that's probably okay. The only thing I would say is in support of that, and I don't know if it would be consequential, but nobody wants to take the voting process lightly in any way whatsoever. In fact, that's precisely why we take the criticism so seriously. And the learning, the pride, the national pride even that's involved in the very act of voting is not something that we would ever want to take lightly. And if there's a way to cultivate that at a younger age, maybe by identifying beginners citizens in the same way that we have beginners licenses, if any way is good. It has to be good. It wouldn't take us necessarily away from the more serious problems that plague us, though.
Yes?
My name is Amir on this room. Here's the question. The question is this, it's a commentary and a question. The world today, like often in the last 500 years, is going through a metamorphosis. And I don't mean just a metamorphosis because we ended up waking up in the morning and we were insects. Kafka, Toronto. Metamorphosis in culture. Our culture is undergoing change, rapid, crucial change, everywhere in the world, especially in the major countries. I mean, the kind of change that has occurred since the decline and rise of empires themselves. And changes are not withering away at the state, but withering away now in some societies with middle class. That's basic change. There is a change in the way we look at gender issues, class and gender, and then if a country like Canada, because you're addressing this specifically, is undergoing changes in ethnicity. Now, a lot of people living in the major metropolitan areas of our country, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Philly, Winnipeg, not so much the Maritimes, which is not very ethnic compared to other areas of Canada, but the ethnic votes and the ethnic identity, the ethnic loyalties are not really national in scope. They tend to withdraw into themselves and to help with the general wheel, the common wheel of the national ethos. And I think you see this very, very, I just wonder, both of you can speak to that, is that Canada is, okay, it's mosaic, but in that mosaic, people are so bound up with their own personal ethnic, national problems, their own national problems, because Canada is changing, and we're sort of forgotten by the wayside the old ethics of what Canada was like, say, 50, 60, 100 years ago. I don't know if that makes any sense, but maybe to answer that.
Okay. Whenever we speak of ethnic identity or religious identity or even national identity, I always think it's a very difficult conversation. And one of the things that I'm most struck by, just in my encounters over my years of teaching in a university with younger people, is that Canadians, I think, are most Canadian at heart when they're in Europe and determined not to appear too American. So they sew the Canadian flags on, and maybe the odd hockey game during the time of the Olympics. But outside of that, I don't see a very strong national identity in the Canadian context, but I do see fairly strong regional and ethnic identity. I'm from away. I've always been struck by New Brunswick's character and the fact that identities in New Brunswick are very powerful and very strong, very different from the ones I experienced growing up in Ontario. And I can honestly say I simply don't know what to make of them.
I guess I don't see things having changed quite so dramatically. I think it's a long-standing element of Canada. There's been, quite significant divisions across cultures and regions. And that, despite, you've had significantly higher immigration levels and people come from many different parts of the world, but I still do feel we do very well in terms of integrating people into Canada on different levels. There are certain challenges. I mean, socioeconomically, we're not doing as well as we used to, I think, with new arrivals. But overall, I feel that, I don't really see that as a significant problem. I do think that we're continuing to, we've always had a somewhat loose sense of what Canada is, and I guess that's another reason why I might turn to the sense of a political element to what it means to be Canadian, building a sense of ourselves through politics, rather than any kind of cultural notion is going to be a more successful strategy. And that's something that, new Canadians can participate in as much as old Canadians.
Over there.
Hello, I'm Matthew. Actually, I study English and history here at the University of New Brunswick. First, as a young Canadian, I'll say first I entirely disagree. Just speaking anecdotally, I suppose from my own perspective, but friends, acquaintances, classmates alike, I definitely disagree that there's this disengagement with not only political issues in Canadian context, but even globally. Paul, you mentioned, think locally, act globally. I think that's something that we should have to abide by going into the 21st century. And I guess the question I want to ask is maybe when we start to talk about solutions, ways of moving forward, that within universities, a focus on interdisciplinary studies could be beneficial in sort of educating new generations going into the future. I'm speaking mostly because the concerns that I feel as a young male going in my 20s on overpopulation, resourcification, climate change, and shutting down political discourse definitely doesn't help dealing with any of those things. So I guess once again, whether interdisciplinary education at post-secondary, maybe high school level, high school's not an example, but at secondary education levels might be a good idea.
Well, when I talked about civics education, but I think I would, you could definitely expand that to simply a greater emphasis on the kind of things we teach within the Faculty of Arts, and that, having a broad understanding of culture, of history, sociology, all these things make their contributions to creating someone who has a rounded view, a full view of their society, and that contributes to their wanting to be involved and to make a difference. I would definitely support that, and the word civics is probably maybe a little bit narrow. But back on the question of just I do think that there's certainly, I run into this a fair bit, I guess. You do a talk on engagement and disengagement, and as I said, naturally you're talking to people who are engaged. But I do find it quite striking when you kind of try to look out at the larger population and get this sense. It really does seem as if some people are really quite tuned out of a lot of the issues that are taking place. When we look at the population as a whole across the board, I think some of the numbers personally are quite striking. And also anecdotally, I guess, I'll have students who are in my political science class, so they naturally have some interest. And there may be an election coming up, so now we're talking about the election, and they'll tell me that, I sat down in the cafeteria with my friends, and I asked them what they thought of the election, and they turned to me and said, well, what election? So, sometimes it's pretty profound, is just sort of being a little bit not interested in what's going on, but maybe they have other interests in terms of other types of issues that don't fit into traditional electoral politics, and that's certainly the case for some.
I would just be inclined to push the distinction between politically engaged and a kind of civics apathy or an disenchantment with the formal political process. I have never seen political apathy in younger people, never. I've always seen, and I mean, maybe perhaps it's because as we're always running into people who are interested in political science. It's a bit of a biased population, I suppose. But I've never seen it. I've always seen people who are keenly interested, younger people who are keenly interested in the world, keenly interested in how to improve things. It is heartwarming. But that's quite different from civics apathy. And indeed, what I would want to suggest is that political interest, in a very keen sense of the political and of the political in the world around us, could actually promote even greater degrees of civics apathy if things don't change.
Okay, I've got a speakers list of about 5, so what I'm going to do is start to do what Tom suggested at the start, which is cluster. So we'll take a couple. There was, I think you, sir, wasn't there somebody in the middle here other than the young woman? Oh yeah, it was you. Sorry. You make 6, Greg.
Tom, you talked about neoliberalism and how that's affecting our lives in different ways, and you both talked about the mass media. But I was kind of thinking when you were talking about church basement, you were talking about the way we're being educated in the process. I was thinking about time crunch and how these neoliberal policies that have come in are affecting everyday average families and whatnot. Whenever you have both partners working and have to come home with children and whatnot, they can't spend those 12 hours in the church basement. So how does that happen? I just wondered if both of you could speak to that aspect, bringing the neoliberalism to a different aspect of our lives.
Okay, hold that thought, speakers. Mike?
Michael Lyons, Sociology and Economics. Paul, I have a question for you and for Thomas and Austin too. Up until 1991, anytime somebody wrote down their identity, ethnic identity as Canadian, the census was struck out. Because clearly you could Canadian, you could recode it as either British, English, or French. Since 1991, individuals have been allowed to identify themselves as Canadian, and what's been going on is that the rate has gone up so that by 2006, we're 25% of the population. So that could be used as evidence to suggest that there actually is some sort of national identity forming. And my question for you is, how do you reconcile these two trends? They seem to be going in opposite directions. It's a bifurcation of the population into well-engaged, well-read, well-educated people that vote versus other, or is there something else happening?
Why don't you take that one, which was specific to you, and then we'll do the other one.
Okay. So just to clarify then, in 2006, about 25% chose that as an option, just as a question asked about ethnic identity, and then they would answer Canadian. And you say it's been an upward trend. Okay. Well, I guess I'm not sure I have an easy answer. I guess it might be curious to have that broken down a little bit to be able to analyze it as to who answered Canadian. I don't know if you know anything about the age differences in that respect, or a lot of, this is among... Right, yeah. I mean, well, that's consistent, I think, with what I was suggesting in response to Myron's question there, where I do feel that, people who arrive here are, very much wanting to adapt and to embrace Canada and to contribute to that as much as anybody else. So, yeah, I guess I'm struggling to I don't really have a good answer in terms of trying to reconcile it with some of the things I was talking about in terms of, the subjective sense of Canadian identity among the population. Sorry, I can't do anything better. Well, I might have to think about that one a little bit more. Yeah.
So the previous question?
Okay. Cody, you're absolutely right. Time, it's the typical family. There even StatsCan studies have shown this even in the recent period. You may be even drawing upon those when you pose the question. Families have less time on their hands owing to the pressures of just running a family in an age of austerity when wages are flatlining and so on. Work hours are rising. You're absolutely right. The only thing I would add to your question is I think that when we're talking about the available time in families, it differs for men and women in the families. Certainly conventions have women doing a lot more work in the family and bearing a lot more of the burdens, so it's not even equal in the context of neoliberalism and the way neoliberalism has impacted the families. All I would want to say, though, is that somehow, even though things were very difficult in earlier times, people still managed to pull it off and still managed to be fairly extensively involved in political discussions. And if they could do it then, I at least have some faith that it could be done now. But you're absolutely right. It's not easy, and insofar as it's more difficult on a family to free up time in the contemporary period, it's going to be even harder.
You make it impossible for me not to comment that, of course, much of that 19th century or even 18th century discussion was totally gendered, but we'll leave that alone.
Totally, yes, it was. Yes, absolutely.
So I'm going to do 3 this time. The woman straight in front of me, who I should know, but forget.
My name is Tracy Glenn. I'm just married studies here at Ottawa. Maybe I should go. So one of Murray Smith's critical sociologists at Brock, one of his 10 questions for the radical left, not the left that you were talking about that's not discernible from the right, in his book, Global Capitalism in Crisis, he asks about the proper relationship between strategies and tactics. And why is it so that so many on the left have allowed themselves to be pushed to the right, effectively abandoning the strategies for what we want in the name of tactics? So Smith asks if the insistence of many on the left to always give so-called critical support to the Labour or the left parties is justifiable any longer. And I think we find ourselves asking that question again with the recent election of Thomas Mulcair as the NDP federal leader. He wants to modernize the NDP, a la Tony Blair, and he's also not very different than Harper in his uncritical support for Israel and imperialist missions. So he's also been quite silent on what I would argue beyond Occupy has been the greatest challenge to neoliberalism today, and that being the massive student strikes in Quebec happening right now. And I think that's not surprising given that Mulcair was just a few short years ago a cabinet minister in Charest's government. So I just was wondering maybe if you could comment on how many of us, I think, easily turn into opportunists maneuvering and offering political support for the lesser evil that now means disastrous consequences for the majority of us, and maybe comment on the relationship between proper strategies and tactics.
Okay, hold that thought. Carmen?
I don't think I need mine.
You do need to introduce yourself, though.
Pardon me? Carmen Poulin from psychology here at UNB. I just want to mention a couple of anecdotes. One is that I was raised during the Quiet Revolution, so not being political is hard to imagine, given that when I went to English high school, I opened my mouth and spoke French, and I got a realization really quick that I wasn't a political being right then. But it was an English high school, and I only could speak French. But the other anecdote that I want to talk about and speaks to the issue of getting students involved. I teach in psychology. Psychology is a discipline that focuses on individuals rather than society, I'm told, on a daily basis. And I was teaching one morning before, not the last federal election, but the one before, and I asked the student how many were going to vote, and it was in my history of psychology class, and I had about three or four hands that definitely were going to vote, and it was a classroom full, like 80 people. I went home and I was just flabbergasted. So I thought, what can I do about this? So I dug out this email that I had received from a
take one more, and then we'll do answers, and then there's a couple of more, and I think that probably, despite the invocation for 20-hour sessions, that'll probably be it. Yes?
My name's Chris Missard. I'm an organizer with the Green Party and former other kind of supporter, other party supporter. I'm very concerned with the systemic problems that we have within the voting system that we have for the first past the post, for example. And I'd like to, I'm also concerned with a lot of talk about a referendum on proportional representation. And I do believe, considering the voting patterns of New Brunswick, we could lose that election, that referendum, easily. Right? I want to ask you, I have a little follow-up question considering your answer, and I'd like to ask you about, especially you, Mr. Howe, about, because I know you're in favor of proportional representation, and so I'd like to ask you about that.
Okay. You want to start, Paul? Hope you've been taking notes.
Yeah. So I guess in terms of then the question around proportional representation was just how might a successful referendum be brought about in New Brunswick? Yeah, and just as background, I guess I would say, yeah, definitely proportional representation is one of those methods I would see as trying to create a more encompassing government. I mean, you would simply have a government that represented a true majority of voters rather than the kind of false majorities we have now. So it would be one of the structural changes that would make good sense and would also engender greater cooperation between political parties who would have to work together in coalition governments and, you know, change the political culture in a significant way. And so, you know, the failed referendum campaigns in other provinces, the idea has been that, you know, education has often been lacking. You know, a lot of people, again, do not know a great deal about proportional representation, and when the campaigns have been held in Ontario, Prince Edward Island, and then in BC twice, that they were rejected for the most part because of people simply not knowing as much as they might have about the system. When people learn more, they tended to favor the system. So that's the key thing, and I guess the methods of doing that, I mean, I would probably turn to, you know, the kind of ideas Thom is presenting, that, you know, those who are advocates need to talk to other people, need to talk to friends and acquaintances, and it will have to be a fairly gradual process of building momentum and support. And so I agree that, I mean, I'm probably not as optimistic as I'd like to be, but New Brunswickers also have been a little bit more maybe politicized by events of the last few years as well. The sense that government always doesn't always do as you would wish, and how do you get greater citizen control when governments may undertake actions that you're not happy with? So I think we've maybe got some potential there in terms of some latent citizen activism, as well as, you know, manifest and latent that's there in the population. So I think it could be done. And then back on, I guess, Carmen's observation, I mean, I agree, these are the kind of things, these stories or actual involvements that young people might have themselves in tangible, concrete issues of trying to bring about change. These are the kind of things that can make younger people change. And so the experiential element of civics education as well, telling young people, let's choose an issue, let's work on it. And that'll be part of our civics education process this year, I think, is also something that's been proven to be quite effective, and therefore is something that, yeah, definitely should be part of the mix as well. Maybe working on a PR campaign would be a good project for people to kind of bring the two together a little bit.
I'll address Carmen's question first. I think you're absolutely right. When we hear that there is a kind of disengagement or a lot of apathy with respect to the political process and a refusal even to participate in it, it's not always born of a political insightfulness or even a kind of coherent political sensibility. Not always, but it often is. But when we reflect on the very difficult road of enfranchisement, even in the Canadian context, for example, especially the fact that it was something that unfolded very unequally for property people versus people who didn't have property, and then for men and women. And it wasn't really even that long ago when women couldn't vote in this country. When we reflect on that long and difficult road, when we see what has happened to the civics process at the moment, I think it is upsetting and disconcerting. Unfortunately, though, that conclusion I don't think in any way overrides the fact that voting to many is an irrelevant exercise at the moment, and that it doesn't bring any substantial change. And that's the unfortunate kind of difficulties that we face. I would want to, though, just respond to the fact that I do think that something such as proportional representation, at least insofar as it carved out space for alternative political parties, parties perhaps with more critical messages, could then count on a certain percentage of the vote and not necessarily have to tailor their political discourse in a way that made them try to at least salvage one seat every once in a while or 2 seats. And that possibly is something that could re-energize a political process and could even, in a way, address the question that was raised a bit by Tracy, and that is that in the kind of narrowing of this political discourse in the late part of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century, this narrowing of this political discourse has meant that parties with alternative visions and so on have been largely shunted to the side and almost eradicated. And a proportional representation may very well create the kind of political opportunities to revive that kind of a discourse so that politics can heal itself at least a little bit.
Thank you. Well, I'll leave it up to the audience. I've got 2 more, and I was going to cut it off, but I'm seeing some people at the back. So maybe, Greg, are you still on the list? No? Dominic?
My name is Dominic County, I'm leader of the Provincial Democrats. And just from my previous life, as I worked with developing civic education and political education programs with parties and civil society groups, mainly in Asia. And just speaking to the point that you were making earlier, which I think is quite valid, that all across South Asia and Southeast Asia, there have been studies done about the influence of television arriving into people's homes. And what you would see was a period where mass politics was extremely popular. People would turn up for those sort of 12-hour debates, or sometimes they would go on for literally for days. But once TV started to arrive, the level of political engagement dropped dramatically. So I think that you're both correct, that it's on the one hand, politics was a form of entertainment, but on the other hand, because it was entertaining, people enjoyed participating in it, and then some of them came to be much more politically engaged and active, and that engagement and activism carried on into other areas of life. And it leads into something else, which is more of a problem for us here, I think, where putting a left-right divide on it, that if you are keener on politics of regimentation and obedience, to put it bluntly, which I think you could use to perhaps unfairly characterize the right, then a world of sound bites and instructions and the sort of words that you were talking about is appealing and works very well as an effective means for engaging people. Like, you will turn up here, we will do this, we will do it now. It's a way of getting people to work together. Whereas, as a veteran of many long 12-hour days in church basements for the Democrats, if anyone does enjoy the idea of that, please come and talk to me afterwards. Very, very happy. But that process is much more difficult for some of the reasons people were identifying. You do have the problem that everyone is out at work, that people are exhausted, that the amount of time that's being taken out of people's lives to participate in active politics or in any other area of their community has really been diminished. But I wanted to end with my comment with a challenge, though. That part of the problem is that from the side of the left, we've become so completely pessimistic. And I hear that coming from you when you talk about don't bother getting involved. In my party, in the last 2 years, we've seen a 45-year drop in the average age of our party members, and the membership has gone up by more than 5 times. Not because we don't have any seats, we have limited influence, but we offer people a way to get involved, and their opinions are respected. They can have arguments about what they believe in. And if we have people who are inclined towards the left or the center-left of politics going into universities, which is supposed to be the place where hopefully you be galvanized and go off to take a role in your community, if you're told that organized politics is a waste of time, it's no wonder people don't get involved. And I hear this, and I'm not trying to pin this on you personally, obviously, but across the most Western countries, this is a huge problem. That because the more extreme left parties are being discredited, now more moderate left politics is also just seen as being an irrelevance by many people in university departments. And it makes it very hard for those of us trying to change the world one small step at a time to do our jobs. So I think it's very well to say that, that politics is pointless and all these factors mean that anything that we do is not likely to change things. But if we could get some more help from our friends in academia, it would make it a lot easier to change the world. And I'm not speaking necessarily as a pure partisan. I think it would apply to people on any of the parties of the center left. Thank you very much.
Tom?
If I could, I just want to stress that I'm not saying don't get involved. I'm saying that a withdrawal from politics is a perfectly rational thing to do. And those things are profoundly different. However, I don't think the NDP is changing the world one step at a time or one little bit at a time. The NDP has endorsed hook, line, and sinker the neoliberal agenda without qualification from top to bottom. So well, we may disagree on that, but what I would want to stress is that political apathy is impossible. It's civics apathy that we're talking about.
I'm going to take Dominic's typification of the right to have an authoritarian moment. There are refreshments at the back of the room, and I'm sure both of the speakers would be happy to engage in further dialogue, but I think we're going to bring the formal session to an end. So on your behalf, I'd like to thank our speakers, Paul Howe and Thom Workman.